So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hannah Gardner, and I am the program coordinator here at InterArts Matrix. So thank you very much for attending this afternoon's X-Camera talk by artist Meg Harder. Sheila McMath, the artistic director of InterArts Matrix, will introduce Meg more fully in a moment. But before, I'd like to welcome you here today. So the X-Camera series began in the spring of 2019, when a group of people who were interested in the arts began gathering at Fresh Ground Cafe / Common Studios in downtown Kitchener. So this happened every Friday afternoon until March 2020, where they would gather to hear a lecture by an interdisciplinary artist or professional. So the lectures were followed by a Q&A period, and then time for people to stay in the cafe space, eat lunch together, continue conversations, and build a community. So it's in this spirit of supporting artists and building community that X-Camera has been relaunched virtually on Zoom. The series will continue on Fridays at 1 for the foreseeable future. So Meg will begin soon and will speak until about 10 to 2. So we encourage you to engage in the chat with comments as the lecture happens. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A where Meg will address the questions. Following this, we'll open up the room. So if you're able to stay past 2, we encourage you to do so, to introduce yourself, let us know what you've been up to or what you intend to work on. So we'd like this space to be open for discussions about potential future collaborations as well. So please share your ideas if you'd like. So we're very pleased to have Meg Harder here with us today. And before, we would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee and Métis peoples. So we recognize the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant to this land. And the Dish with One Spoon covenant is a peace agreement made between Indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and to the earth, that we should only take what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. So today, this gathering space is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land where we live, work, and learn. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. It's my pleasure to welcome Meg Harder here this afternoon. Meg's formative education was at the University of Waterloo, which included 6 months of study at the Bazellel Academy of Art in Jerusalem. Meg's work is truly multi and interdisciplinary in nature, as she engages with drawing, sculpture, installation, public art, collaborative performance, and experimental writing. Her artistic practice has been supported and celebrated by grants and awards from various sources, including the Ontario Arts Council, Waterloo Region Arts Awards, BMO First Arts, and the Nancy Lou Patterson Award. She has participated in artistic residencies at Quartz Lab in Kitchener, the Rare Charitable Research Reserve in Cambridge, the Art Institute of Chicago's Oxbow program located in Michigan, the Banff Center for the Arts, and the Vermont Studio Center. Her work has been presented in solo exhibitions at the Center for Peace Advancement at Conrad Grebel University College and Kitchener Public Library. And she's also participated in numerous group exhibitions at art galleries, festivals, and forums across Ontario. In her career, Meg has also been professionally engaged as a teaching assistant at the University of Guelph and the University of Waterloo, and as a program leader for KW Accessibility, and as a tour guide for Open Ears Festival and Kafka in Kitchener. So on a personal note, I was introduced to Meg's work about 8 years ago, and I've watched her career with interest and admiration since that time. Meg participated in the 2014 Tri-City Stopgap inaugural exhibition, an open call exhibition that featured work by 64 regional artists in an abandoned candy factory on the border of Kitchener and Waterloo near Union Street. As I recall, she arrived with her team and assembled a makeshift dwelling from natural materials in the industrial building. Meg's sculpture had presence and power in that space and remains for me among the most memorable works from that exhibition. So as I've said, I've watched Meg's career for a while, for some time, but today's talk will be my first opportunity to hear Meg speak in a more comprehensive way about what she's been up to lately. So I'm really looking forward to it. So I will thank our sponsors for Ex Camera, Ontario Arts Council, City of Waterloo, City of Kitchener, and City of Cambridge. And Meg, you can take it away. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Sheila and Hannah, and inviting me to be here today. And thank you to my guests for your attention for the next little bit. The following will just sort of be a short talk / reading of some about some of the work that I've been working on, as well as some writing that I've been doing that's been feeding the artwork. And that includes some discursive writing, but also more experimental work and some sound-based poetry. So let's get started. And if you guys can't hear me or there's some issues, just please let me know. Okay, so it seems pertinent in an artist talk to tell you something about myself, but an artist bio is always sort of inevitably a kind of autofiction. Eileen Miles has said the first fiction is your name. So who then is Meg Harder, and what can I tell you about her? The following is a fictional autobiography composed using found text from two sources: a German to English translation of my grandfather's life story growing up in the Soviet Union, and excerpts from a best-selling autobiography of a major figure in Western popular culture whose ancestors hail from the same region of the Soviet Union. To write my fictional autobiography, I formed each initial sentence by splicing two sources together. From there, I worked the text until I felt it came to some sort of poetic, coherent whole, though not necessarily grammatically coherent. And my reading will be accompanied by images from a recent installation I completed in a decommissioned Mennonite farm on the outskirts of Kitchener. So this is called Dutch, the installation of the work is called Dutch Interior, and the experimental writing piece is called 30 Lines for 30 Years. So an egg. She sat up in a bled cloud of flat beach, aware of where she came from. The bed was a shoreline, and words were a secret language used by adults conspired against my siblings. The room smelled of bread yeast, where my mother no longer stands like she used to be. Above the fireplace, my father learned to understand most and speak some by carving toys with his eyes. The place was a top floor walk-up, where he used the words to tell dirty jokes to his friends. On the same block, somewhere in the background, a 500-year-old oral dialect. I'd been there once before, saw his ghost in the Mirror River crystallized on his tongue. I walked over to the window toward one of many dialects. The air was bitter and flat because of northern plains, but also because the people were simple. It was mid-afternoon, and the bird in the cuckoo clock whispered, "Our only homeland is our mother tongue, but a word is a bottomless pit." It was maybe 10 years cycling between persecution and exploitation, hence mother's tongue extended all over the world. She was a nonconformist, a non-integrator, knowing not much else was holding together across time and space. She lived in a place between teeth, hiding out in a journey not as planned. She was like a character song singing lost contact. There was an undercurrent of upheaval baptizing them in the faith. I was red gold hair, eyes privileged with responsibilities of citizenship. I worked as I wounded, survived the war. Others lived as husband and wife, brother, sister, cousins, hard to tell, walking through the heather. Her friends had their own primitive way of looking at things, which became a lifelong hobby. She asked him once, "Whose evil eye?" And he said, "I needed help." According to him, Dracula ruled the world, setting out to achieve our goals. Being the heir of the 40s and 50s culture, God could not always help her. Practically speaking, she needed the aid of a computer spell check program. Within 10 years' time, I will translate my story, oral history on paper. with folk songs embedded in my eyes like a religious employment was not easy to come by. Folk songs transcended the immediate culture, come down off the trees and confess. Before she moved into a place of my own, accidentally too close to the action. Sometimes for a night or two, a strange feeling that she was somehow physically removed going on around me and I was watching the show. She stayed in endless streams of human misery. I probably stayed in the echo of that flat northern vista too long. So a research interest of mine is the preservation and dissemination of Mennonite culture in Southern Ontario. And I'm interested in investigating the structures that support this preservation and the end to which these fragments are being evoked. So I've been looking a lot at collections of Proctor art in regional archives. Proctor is a style of illuminated manuscript that Mennonites use to decorate Bibles and hymn books and important sort of religious or rites of passage sort of documents. So this next essay is titled Notes on the Disselfink, and it looks specifically at the commonly occurring goldfinch motif in Proctor art. So just to ground this essay, I'd like to just read a quote from Sarah Ahmed, who is a thinker that inspired a lot of this research. So she said, diasporic spaces do not simply begin to take shape with the arrival of migrant bodies. It is more that we only notice the arrival of those who appear out of place. Those who are in place also must arrive. They must get here, but arrival is more easily forgotten or not even noticed. So along Kitchener's new ion light rail system are works of commissioned public art. At Fairway Station, right next to Kitchener's biggest shopping mall, are two large colorful bird sculptures entitled Shaping Residency. The project is described on Waterloo Region's public transit site as inspired by the Proctor drawing tradition seen in the founding communities of the Waterloo area during the 1800s. The bird motif referenced in this public art sculpture is called a disselfink and frequently appears in diasporic Mennonite folk art around the world. In Shaping Residency, the quaint disselfink is poised as a harbinger of Genesis, flying towards us from the founding of the region to tell us of where we come from. The family tree is a popular form in Proctor art. The patriarch is fashioned as the trunk, and all his descendants spread out from the center. However, the family tree is always incomplete. Hidden from view is a never-ending fractal of relations. Recently, I read that music historians have been moving away from the questions of origins. The problem is, when you go back and research how people lived, there's too much cultural mixing. We supposedly live in an age of globalization, but looking at human history, we see how incredibly globalized people have been for hundreds of years. The question of origins in Canada is shorthand for one's family's previous national identity before coming to this country, assuming you're not Indigenous. This has always been a hard question for me to answer succinctly. I was born in St. Catharines, Ontario. My mom is from Dorval, Quebec, but she's not a Francophone. She is a descendant of immigrants from Leinster Province of Ireland, the Isle of Lewis in Scotland, and a man with an unknown background. My dad's side is Russian Mennonite, but if you ask them where they are from, they say they're German. In truth, they're from Novorossiya, a colonial province of the Russian Empire, now the Ukraine. They were first forcibly relocated to the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, now Kazakhstan, and refugees in Germany briefly before moving to Ontario. The further I dig through time to find the answer to the question of origins, the more vague the pursuit becomes. For example, Mennonites living in Russia were descendants of Dutch Anabaptists who settled for about 250 years in West Prussia, which is now Poland, where they consolidated Plattdeutsch, a dialect of German, as their lingua franca. From the perspective of deep time, humans are essentially nomadic and cultural boundaries relative, not real. What seems more pertinent politically and socially are the conditions of one's arrival. So believing they are in the world, but not of the world, Mennonites were theologically primed from becoming too attached to a particular region. It seems this orientation was a useful adaptation for colonial settlers. Their Protestant work ethic, farming proficiency, and intimate sovereignty enabled them to spread easily from Europe into the various colonial frontiers they were invited by states and empires to settle, such as the imperial province of the Russian Empire I spoke of earlier, the Paraguayan Chaco, and the British colonies of Pennsylvania and Upper Canada. The Disselfink was brought to Block 2 of the Haldeman Treaty Territory of Six Nations in the early 1800s by Mennonite settlers heading north from Pennsylvania. The history of Mennonite arrival and settlement in the Haldeman Tract in Upper Canada inevitably contains blind spots. The past is a shifting terrain built from fragments and subject to the ideologies of the day. However, rigorous study of the past is very important. Symbolic monuments, like the public artwork shaping Residency, encourage us to forget, I think. They act as a public placeholder for memory, but relay no real information about what happened. To counter such forgetting, the following is a brief summary of Mennonite settlement on the Grand River, derived mainly from the research of local historian Reginald Good. What seems clear is that Mennonite arrival was connected to the British Empire's bid to gain more power and influence in the so-called New World. Following the American Revolution, the British negotiated several controversial land surrenders for the Mississauga First Nation and converted strategic sections into land grants for loyalists. In a decree known as the Haldeman Proclamation, the Haudenosaunee Six Nations received land surrounding the Grand River as repayment for their loyalty and as reparations for the loss of their territory south of the Great Lakes. Mennonites acquired Block 2 of the Haldeman Treaty lands through a British prospector who converted an income-generating land lease agreement with the Six Nations into a permanent land sale. Mennonites arrived in 1803, not to an empty but a managed landscape, still being used and lived on by the Mississauga people. Early Mennonite and Mississauga relations included mutualism, conflict, and exploitation. The Mississaugas hunted wolves, which helped Mennonites protect their herds, and provided Mennonites with fish and wild game. However, Mennonite settlement expansion was sometimes met with resistance. A grist mill erected near Galt was burned down and defended thereafter by the Mississaugas. Land loss, disease, and ensuing famine in the Mississauga community was worsened by the sale of alcohol from Mennonite distillers. Europeans of various backgrounds continued to arrive and expand the new settlements. In 1837, many Potawatomi people arrived to the region after a long journey north to avoid forcible relocation to reserves by the American government. Their arrival escalated tensions in the region, which came to a head in 1840 when a Mennonite woman was reportedly raped. Settlers, including Mennonites, signed a petition for civil authorities to restore order to the region, and around this time, a local justice of the peace came across two men whipping an Indigenous man tied to a tree. The petition and vigilante call to action effectively forced the Mississauga people out of Waterloo Township. After 1840, mention of the Mississauga villages disappeared from the historical record. Writing in 1845, Mississauga elder Kakawakanati, known as Peter Jones, said, "The Indian territories have been taken away till all our possession is now so small that you would almost require a magnifying glass to see them. We are surrounded on all sides by white settlers, still encroaching on us. I'm afraid that in a few years, we will hardly have enough left to lay our bones upon, or ground enough to cover our bodies." The Mennonite migration to the Grand River watershed mirrored so many others. In seeking refuge from their own persecution, they aided in the displacement and ethnic cleansing of others. So before we go on, I'd like to take a brief intermission and read a letter that I wrote to my cat. So a letter to my cat, Ozymandias. Isn't it strange how words are so much less clear than they once were? I can still remember a before time when words predictably snapped together when held in proximity and didn't disturb me, how they just sailed easily between teeth and ears. Now sometimes I spend so long looking at the same sentence, repeatedly checking all the words in the Oxford English Dictionary, reading the etymologies and returning to the sentence so I can ferret away my newfound knowledge in the empty troughs between the lines, only to find they are actually already full. Not only this, but while I was away, the letters had become these strange shapes I had never seen before. There are still moments, dear Cat, when sentences will enter my brain like a hot needle, and I know what it is the author is thinking about. But then I go on to share these words with someone else and find that the sounds and the letters have migrated to the far side of the vast cavern since I last checked on them. In these moments, my heart beats so fast, and I just finger the alphabet soup for something solid so I myself don't dissolve with them. P.S. I left you dinner in the fridge. Please help yourself. Okay, so back to our story of Mennonite arrival and the disselfink. If one looks through an archive of diasporic Mennonite folk art, you would notice the commonly occurring disselfink motif rarely resembles their European namesake. Like a game of telephone, the disselfink was altered in every reiteration, having been copied by generations of artists who no longer resided in the bird's territory, nor knew what meaning that particular creature might have for its early illustrators. In these new lands, the disselfink did not come to resemble the birds in their everyday experience, but instead grew increasingly unworldly or domestic. This dislocation from place is echoed in the shift in media and palette choice used to paint Proctor. Before the 1940s, many scholars believed that the Proctor artists made their own pigments from natural sources. Scientific analysis, however, has revealed that Proctor artists were increasingly using commercially available paints imported from Europe. The pigment choices and style of Anna Weber, which is featured here, and Anna Weber, who is one of the last Mennonites to produce traditional Proctor in the Waterloo region, is notable. Her birds are fantastical creatures painted in a palette that is almost the perfect inverse of the natural landscape. But given the violent legacy of Mennonite settlement and Proctor's symbolic and material conditions of dislocation, it seems strange that a public art piece called Shaping Residency chooses the disselfink as a motif of the region's identity. Many books published about Proctor include theorizing as to what symbolic meaning Mennonite motifs might carry. Good luck and friendship seem to be this bird's charge, but the idea of an unchanging symbolic meaning is just as absurd as a quaint Mennonite origin story for Waterloo. Like all images, the meaning and potency are ever-changing. To early European folk artists, the disselfink was once a recognizable character of the natural environment. Now it is a document of an echo, of a lost bioregional connection, deafened through repetition, movement, time, and a theological inclination that kept one's eyes on the heavens rather than the earth. Its meaning is as multiple as the hands who have traced it, and like the history of Waterloo, it contains an image of both good luck and hardship, friendship and violence. Okay, so now we have some shared historical background, but where does the art come in? So remember when I was describing the past as a shifting terrain? As I understand it, I think art helps us see and feel that shifting terrain. I see art as a means to escape well-worn paths in the mind. Art makes us question the straightness and the solidity of those paths and helps us perceive things we didn't know were lurking in plain sight. And it makes space for you, my audience, to fill in the gaps. So in birding culture, there's a practice of developing standardized bird song mnemonics. So humans will map phrases like drop it, cover it up, pull it up, onto the songs of birds like the brown thrasher to aid in its recognition when you're out in the field. And conversely, phrases like hello cookie can be heard echoing from the tree canopies across Australia, where reportedly escaped birds have been teaching their wild counterparts how to speak English phrases. Language and signs more broadly seem to me like enigmatic eggs. A word is a vessel of sound that can be learned by parrots and person alike. The egg is not empty, it has been endowed with contents from its mother bird culture. These contents hidden within the shell are a matter of the imagination. They can only be guessed at by the egg's connection to the life cycle. This life cycle might be thought of as a kind of grammar. The rupture of meaning occurs when the egg is removed from the cycle, placed in a carton, and becomes indistinguishable from its peers, and then becomes, say, an omelet. This disruption is a kind of death, and it is an opportunity for something new to emerge. The egg, removed from its original context, carries with it particular qualities such as scale and color and shape, sound, that can be manipulated and recontextualized in different environments. When this happens, a new genealogy and potential is bestowed onto the egg. When I make art, it is this opportunity for disruption I'm looking for. A mutation of found images, objects, and words have become the cornerstone of an artistic process I've been developing called meta-think. I use meta here to denote the idea of change, transformation, or permutation, and think to refer to the root of the word, or finch to recall the mutating think in the Mennonite folk art I spoke about earlier. I take artifacts, so seemingly closed fragments of the past, with me to the studio where they become a puzzle. The challenge is to maximally excite its elements without completely betraying the form that gives it some distinction. So meta-think begins with a sort of tracing. A trace, like a written quotation of something else, evokes its source, but it can also be recontextualized by the signifiers that surround it and the shift in time and place in which it reappears. Meta-think is a process that can be permuted through various mediums and various styles. The task of reanimating fragments of culture from the past without evoking some feeling of reactionary nostalgia seems to me quite tricky. My interest in working with Mennonite folk art is not out of some interest to reestablish a romanticized vision of the past. No, it's to combat this romantic image, this well-worn path in the mind. I'm looking to uncover some yet unrealized potential. Meta-think combines an irrational, rule-based or chance-reliant system with intuitive processes to prompt something unexpected and subconsciously mediated. Another way to think about meta-think is as translation of the past into the present. Lynn Hegenian's description of translation has been very influential for me in developing my process. So I'll read one quote of her theory of translation. One must approach the task of translation without enlightenment, illusions of progress, and expectations of ultimate clarification. To place a work in translation is to place it in transition and to leave it there unsettled. The process of translating these works has had the effect of providing me with something like a life apart from my own, a life led by another, though that other turns out to be me. It is not that translation involves the assimilation of someone else's otherness. It does not consist in the uncomplicated making of an American poem out of raw materials of a foreign one, let's say. Rather, translation catalyzes one's own otherness and the otherness of one's own poetry. So by taking fragments of culture out of their natural cycle and removing them from the well-worn patterns of thought and translating them through the meta-think artistic process, I hope to free the proverbial disselfink, to keep it moving, to find new potential and to acquire new unsettled genealogies, even if only momentarily, and then let it continue on its journey of mutation. The result is like a mnemonic for a bird's song. It tells you nothing about the intentions of the bird, but reveals some qualities of its voice, as well as the shape of the mind of the human who came up with it. So one part of art history I've been really fascinated with researching is Russian Futurist book art from the early 20th century, which is called zaum, which is a neologism, meaning beyond sense, or sometimes translated as transrational. Zaum is a sound-based calligraphic poetry. It eschews grammar and is composed with considerations of the word's graphic and phonetic characteristics. Early 20th century Russia was still predominantly peasant population with high rates of illiteracy. And the Russian futurists, many of them from the countryside themselves, had an interest and reverence for folk art and religious iconography. The visuals of zaum poetry strike me as familiar. Sometimes I like to imagine that perhaps the futurists encountered Mennonite folk art on one of their many visits to the countryside north of the Black Sea, where my ancestors were living at that time. So in the spirit of a continued dialogue of influence, imagined perhaps, I started a project I called Flat Ditch Poetry, which involves a Zaum-inspired technique of transrational translation. For this project, I listened to recordings of poetry in Plattdeutsch, the oral dialect spoken by Russian Mennonites I heard growing up at family gatherings in church. Since I don't speak this language myself, I had only ever engaged with it phonetically. I listen to the recordings and I write down the sounds I hear using the English phonemes I have available to me. Next, I massage these fragments of sound into English words without too much regard for syntax. So when I read my transrational translations out loud, they sound like the original, but are composed of English phrases rather than Plattdeutsch. So to end this talk, I would like to transport you back in time to the Stray Dog Cabaret, which is a wine cellar cum theatrical venue in St. Petersburg, where many of the Russian futurists of the early 20th century first voiced their poems, hung their art, and performed their plays. So please close your eyes and imagine yourself in this cellar while I read you selections of my poems. Plattdeutsch. Mountain acorn chains, Plattdeutsch maker, and shim a secret more. Dam way and ale, human sick say amass a new hole in shawl. Red hole ditch, canal, rush, so fill day annum these like what? Eat each day gone the cheated mill, no keen ash rink and sword. Hose ink, knock in verse, shot off beam, others shout. A Plattdeutsch said, so ozone ought mind the young ex-CD goat. But Mother Plattdeutsch to me said, do clunk so warm and true. I thought, lemony, oh, I forget, but today lots to rue. Oily should. In grand event, so oiled in taupe, data that unseen, what not major. Down around hay and direct bolt insult, end block exit and broke no era. Hazing and rope, merry, merry, dark essay noonish, door to shame. Before an archway, rushed a knock, the chickweed over stock to stain. The chickweed ocean, fire washed bloom, so laugh freely, please, and answer truth. It's so hot, so itch, it seems so hot. Dot hill, dot chanting, land you ought. Air from swarm, and they so rich. I've got photo nude under bench. Do oil exceed on mallet itch, till lay flicka via a dark dot chimp. Name me. The apple and the bear dancing, set free and wrote, meow, vote east, and tear up, curse me, skinny goat. Zero bark astral apple, zero bark pesto dew. Act the hand, chest clear, name me through. The boron scenic fruit. Data soul dunk some one machine, yoke sack my lock knees, had nursing. Two truths to few, bush mock a beam, socio sucker caution fiend. Borrowed labor on you adult, breathe a free trade in, tan deer shalt. Duplex unduly harmony, vocal yellow adds dawn chatty. Bold stead at mass, do mean a right, a cup that may bold teeter slight. Bold east on moor, the gruesome fool, but Lord a hay amazing mule. And lastly, in want for new. In want for new, a hyena goes all mean, like animated sin and sand, dawn manic made hate foul. Fact matter chain him, see who made them, a song after sound. You must believe, oil and lick, demon clock, down out, down quick. So that's everything I got.
Hi, Meg.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks so much for your talk. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
It was really great. I feel like I need a while to think, but it's really rich. It's really full, and
yeah, it was short but dense, probably.
It was really rich. It was really great. So I want to sort of circle back to something you said about public art. I think you said public art is often a placeholder for collective memory without any real information. Mm-hmm. I agree often that that's very true. But I'm wondering, like, if you can think of some successful public art pieces that sort of come out of that trapping, or come out of that provocative statement that you made. Like, can you think of like, as an artist, about how to remedy that?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily like, so I guess what I'm trying to say is like, not so much just public art, but like when things seem like they're supposed to be a monument to the past, and like any sort of archive or fragment of the past sort of functions similarly. It takes something from the past and it sort of freezes it materially. And while it does sort of prompt the remembering of the maybe specifics associated with that particular thing, it also like creates a gap in memory where like the things that weren't collected. And because we sort of treat these artifacts or monuments like mnemonic for us, like we put them there so that we ourselves don't even really have to remember. Like the fragment is, or the monument is kind of doing that for us. It doesn't put the onus on people to remember always. And because of the blankness surrounding it, all the gaps in the archive, it also encourages like a forgetting of that as well, because that's not recorded. So it's not, I don't know if it's something that can necessarily be remedied. I think it's just like a reality. And I do say that I think history and remembering things is rigorous study is all very important. But that like we never settle, like that we always continually study the past with rigor and like be mindful of those gaps. So I don't mean this to be like a criticism of all monuments or something, although I think a lot of them are pretty garbage.
Yeah. But, well, a lot of them are sort of an oversimplification of a story or of a moment in history, right? It's sort of authored by one person, by the artist, and it ends up not telling all the tangential story, right? The things that are unsettling, right? Yeah. I
think some embrace ephemerality and like communal organizing more. So, recently we've heard about, all of the bodies that were found in that mass grave and at the residential school out west, and people have been making these sort of ephemeral monuments to the past with collecting those shoes and putting them in one place for a time. And that, I think, like there's something very effective about that it's commemorating in the way that like a bronze statue that was like commissioned and kind of stands for all time in this square doesn't really seem to capture in the same way,
Yeah. There's a potency to the simple action that's happening right now. I think that's different than lots of public art. Yeah, I think you're right. And I just I wanted to ask you about the Russian futurists and that image that you showed, because it seems to be like a marrying of poetry and calligraphy and drawing, like all in sort of one page.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of like contemporary book art or contemporary zines, just like, that idea of an artist making a series of pages in sequence that the only way to experience it is this way, right? And it's text, image, and decorative sort of illumination, right? And I just like, how much time have you spent sort of poring over those Russian futurist drawings? And like, is there seems like there's a connection between those and the drawings that you showed, the pencil drawings, the sort of like there's something similar about them, right? That just that marrying of many media. I don't know, like I'm curious to see more of those. Like I love that they're as old as they are, and that there's that very contemporary feeling to them.
Totally. Yeah, they seem like an early like version of a zine. You're right. I think like the genealogy of zine making probably you can trace back to this sort of publication. I'm sure data poets were maybe doing something similar, publishing in their magazines these like image texts and stuff. But yeah, if you're interested to read more, there's a really great publication called Explodity, and that's where I did a lot of my research. And Yeah, it was the material choices were about dissemination. So they, in addition to doing performances in places like the St. Petersburg bar that I showed you guys, they were also distributing these very small editions of little booklets, and they were often collaboratively made between artists and poets, and they were really kind of like experimenting with their futurist ideas of kind of trying to get to the basics of representation, getting down to like the very fundamentals of the word to the sounds that build up words, and looking like seeing if they could build meaning anew or something. And it sort of was a bit escapist, like trying to remove tradition and build something new. But I think I just appreciated like the collaborativeness of it, the fact that they were yeah, like I'm really interested in the image text, like how text and images can work together. And there's really fascinating ways where they like sort of break the letters that they use to like draw the sounds, or the words. Sometimes they do words start to take on like the shape of something recognizable. So there's like a bit of a crossover there, and experimenting with not only the form of sound, but with the form of making a letter itself. And yeah, and it was just like they were like communist socialists, obviously, and so they wanted to make their work accessible to the public generally. So it's yeah, they made them cheap, and they made enough and kind of just gave them away.
It's really about accessibility, right? It's like and collaboration. It seems like a lot of these are not even made by one author. They're collaborative by like more than one person came together to make, in some cases, even drawing.
Yeah, and it's just interesting too, like how sometimes it feels like writing and art feel like very distinct domains. Like I think sometimes artists are very reluctant to like try to describe their work in words and things like that, because it seems like so fundamentally different than like visual creative expression. But I think like Russian futurist poems really show how words and art can both be like kind of made strange, and that writing isn't always just about communicating an idea like succinctly. It can also capture like affect and aesthetics and lots of other things.
And it can be ambiguous in the way that visuals can be too, right? It doesn't have to be
both made strange. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So I just want to ask you one other question. You talked about sort of ways of reanimating the past without nostalgia. And I think some artists have done that successfully, but it does seem to be a trap. It seems to be something that often happens. And I just wonder what's like, I mean, you talked a lot about what your strategy is for that, but like, I guess this is a longer question. Like, you're sort of smack dab in the middle of your MFA, right? And you're exploring visuals, you're exploring poetry, you're exploring many things simultaneously. And I guess, do you have a sense of how this will manifest? Like how this research will ultimately come to a body of work? Like, will there be performance? Will there be reading? Will there be you sort of present in the work in the way that you have been in this talk? Like, I'm just wondering where you think it'll be in a 6 months or a year or something.
So I hear two questions in there, like the one about nostalgia and then like final performance. Yeah, I think thinking about nostalgia, my classmates and I, we read a text by Svetlana Boyum, I think her name is, and she distinguishes in there like the difference between kind of a reactionary nostalgia and then like a nostalgia that finds potential in the past. And I find I think it's tricky. I think I look at some of my past work and have felt that it was too close to the past, like and just how people have reacted to it, like looking at it, it's like so beautiful, and so like makes people kind of think of something quaint, and it yeah, I think it's easy to screw it up. But yeah, like, so that's why I put my work through such this like crazy, like I've been developing this like kind of extensive mutational process, just because like I want to make something new. Like ultimately it's like you're sifting through things from the past, not to just like reanimate them, like, but to find some hidden potential. Like, I don't know if you could go back, like sort of like a time traveling where you find something that didn't happen that could have happened. So it's not just simply like replaying, but making some new potential possible. So what that looks like, I'm still in the process of like developing my final thesis exhibit. But if you remember like some of the images from my like installation at the beginning, like it's very like kind of the final things like come together very like associatively. Like I try to think about my installations almost like composing a poem. So I think part of escaping something too pointed or too reactionary is like not doing something too too pointed. So like I try to like mix like, you know, influences from the archive with you know, my own lived experience and like other artifacts, and like kind of mix and remix until it kind of becomes its own thing and maybe shows you things from the past that you didn't see previously. So I'm speaking maybe a bit ambiguously, but it's hard to describe art maybe more succinctly than that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's unfair to ask people where they think their work's going to be, because you have to get there, right?
Yeah.
So I know that's an obnoxious question. So I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So my colleague Hannah has a question. I think she's going to pop on and ask it. She's great interest in your work, I think. So
yeah, I'm just wondering, Meg, first of all, thank you for that. But I'm wondering if you can talk more about how you understand your final poems, because as I heard them, I kind of got this sense that they reflect like a linguistic and a poetic displacement that I think is in like your history. And so in some ways they seem to me to be nonsensical but full of meaning. And I wondered how you related that to your own history, linguistically, poetically, geographically, etc.
Yeah. Before I've like talked about them, like almost like as I'm writing them, I'm thinking in the past tense. Like they do sort of maintain like the original cadence and form of the poems that I found in the archive, which are quite, you know, conservative rhyming schemes. They're often about like religious topics. But so it kind of, they feel a bit old in that way, or traditional perhaps. But like, I think the process allows me to not only just like mix it up through chance, like using that kind of transrational parameter where I am sort of bound to the original sound of the poem. So on one hand, I can kind of escape my own desires, but then I do have a small amount of choice actually. And you know, like each word, each sound could actually be a multitude of different sounds. And I'm sure if I wrote it one day and then tried to translate it again another day, I might come up with a different poem. So there's kind of like that element of chance and surprise, I guess, in working the work. How I relate that to my own history, I mean, I think it's like culture sort of is this thing that I think we have the freedom to make our own, you know, like I think the Russian futurists were really interested in throwing out tradition. I think I'm artistically and maybe just like as a person more interested in like I think there can sometimes be something a bit abrupt about just totally trying to get rid of tradition. I mean, we can see how like modernism, like at its full extent, like kind of just became like a void in a lot of ways of anything. So for me, like I see my work as a way of like, yeah, sort of freedom and creating my own culture based on my own experiences, but also drawing on these histories of the past, but not being bound to them, you know.
Yeah, thanks, Meg.
I want to just ask one more question about text, Meg. Like, have you ever made that text in your work sort of more like concrete and visible and legible, and sort of like I'm just thinking about other artists that are sort of engaged with text, and like have you thought about that or done that? Like, because most often the text in my experience so far, it's been read aloud, or it's sort of largely illegible, right? Like it's sort of hard, and I think about public, like particularly with public art, there's some artists who really successfully use really sort of sparse, provocative text, and I wonder if you like those artists, or if you were influenced by them, or if you like. I'm just thinking about like I like sorry, I'm just I'm thinking of Denise St. Marie, who's and Timothy Walker, her local, and like Barbara Kruger and Jenny Holzer and all those kind of text visual artist types. Like, do you like them, or do you think about them at all, or?
Yeah, I think about them. Who do I think? I think the most about language poets. Like, I think that's probably my most major influence for like thinking about how I want to work with text. Not to say that more direct ways of communicating with text don't have their place in poetry or in the arts, but personally, I think like given the material I'm working with and sort of the strategy I'm developing, for me it seems very important to like the language poets. They sort of were interested in writing poems that could only be completed in the mind of the viewer. So it wasn't, you know, there would sort of be like, when you read them, there's like thoughtful associations, like you get a sense of like a mood or visions that might come to your mind, but like a one-to-one meaning are not necessarily the goal. Like I think if they sort of think about it, and I think about my work as kind of like democratic, like I don't know if democratic's quite the right word, but like you get out what you put in, like it
the viewer has to engage,
exactly,
right? Has to do some work, right?
Yeah, and I think just like, yeah, given the material I'm working with, given kind of my, I don't know, disposition or something, I'm more interested in maybe because I'm uncertain myself, like I'd rather have something kind of dialogical out there in the world, like that's people can kind of bring their own sense to.
So like text that can land in various places given the viewer, right? And not
and I'm interested in how they might change in different contexts. So I brought up this picture, like I was sort of early attempts to like maybe visualize some of these poems. More recently I've been like working on recording them, so I think a final install might include like just a sound-based installation along with visuals, rather than like having the sound and then the text drawn out. And that way they kind of like, they can kind of resonate even further, like depending on what like drawing you're looking at the time, or kind of create like little poetic associations between the drawings and or sculptures with the sound-based poems as well.